Hello, and welcome to Eras of Western Women, a limited series CFD podcast. During the 4 episodes, we're celebrating the year of the cowgirl, 2024, as designated by Cheyenne Frontier Days. I'm Diane Schober, the executive director at the Wyoming Office of Tourism, a lifelong fan of CFD, and certainly a proud Wyoming woman, and here and happy to celebrate what women of the West were doing throughout time.
A part of Western history, a legend walking tall. Cheyenne Frontier Days, the daddy of all.
I'm joined by Mike Castle. Mike is the Associate Director and Curator of Collections here at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum, and just has such a depth of knowledge about all of these amazing women. I'm excited to be here with you today, Mike.
It's wonderful to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that we're here on location. We're in this room with all kinds of historical catalogs and reference books at the Old West Museum. But also, you may hear sounds of aircraft flying over us. We talked about a lot of the aviation history in episode number 3, but you may hear some C-130s flying by. It's a guard weekend and other things that are happening because we're right here at Frontier Park.
Right.
And there's a lot of activity happening year round, not just during that 10-day festival in July.
That's true. It never sleeps.
So during the 4 episodes, we've been able to just celebrate the year of the cowgirl and these eras of women with these diverse backgrounds who've shaped the history of our Western way of life. We've covered a lot of territory. We started out with 1800 to 1895, and then we went from 1895 to 1930. Last in our 3rd episode, 1930 to 1960. And here we are now to talk about 1960 to present.
Yes.
And I think really the theme of this, Mike, as we've been discussing, is evolving traditions and what has been happening here at Cheyenne Frontier Days and the inclusion of women in ways of not just competitions, but in leadership roles and really paving the way for a different future for Cheyenne Frontier Days as we utilize the talents of all of those who are willing to serve.
Absolutely. This is, as you mentioned, a very transformative period in Cheyenne Frontier Days history where the way we used to do things begins to shift and change and become more inclusive. And it is definitely moving into the future towards the 22nd century.
Well, and there were a lot of evolving things that were happening in the United States in the 60s and then in the 70s. We could go through each of the decades, but certainly there was, a lot happening with women's movements in the 60s and 70s. And here there were things that were happening, maybe not to the same scale, but things that were, as we said, evolving the traditions. So I know that many of our viewers would be, or listeners would be aware of the volunteer corps that really drives this event and serves this beautiful historic park, this sacred ground of Frontier Park year round. And out of those volunteers are many other subgroups and subcategories,
That's right.
whether they're committees or other volunteer disciplines.
Mhm.
And so one of those is the heels, and then with the W added in it and the front of it, the wheels.
Right.
And just share with us as part of this evolution of this subgroup, what that meant to Cheyenne Frontier Days and the evolution of the volunteer corps that served in those areas.
Absolutely. Well, initially, a lot of the people that were involved were, of course, involved with rodeo. And so you had the cowgirls, you had the cowboys, the committeemen for the general, or in general, were considered to be leaders within business. And mostly in cases of Cheyenne, were considered to be men. And so these guys were basically guiding what Cheyenne Frontier Days was going to be through most of its early history. And that began to shift in the 1960s. But before we talk about some of the other volunteers that are involved, the wheels are a great one to get started with because of all the corps that have been with Cheyenne Frontier Days. This group of women has been involved with CFD for longer than any other group not necessarily longer than any of the committees, but they're certainly as old and as venerable as an organization being involved with Cheyenne Frontier Days as anybody else. The first one, in 1922, Fred Boyce asked his wife, Margaret Boyce, who was an excellent organizer, to help him recreate parades because they had become kind of a very staid, standard affair with a little bit of marching bands, cowboys riding on horses, and they'd been the same year after year after year. And she struck upon the idea that as everybody in the 1920s was transitioning to the automobile, that all of these wonderful carriages are being left behind. Now, it's 1922. She thought it would be wonderful to have some kind of an explanation as we're going through these transitions with airplanes and otherwise. Let's have a pageant of Wyoming transportation. And so she created, on pencil and paper, writing down how this was going to work, a script for how the parades were going to work, starting with a Native American, a woman on horseback with a travois, going through the Oregon Trail, then railroad, then to horse and buggy days, and then up into the modern era with cars. That started in 1922, but in 1925, CFD said that was the perfect thing, and they decided to make it permanent. And they turned to her again. Now, she couldn't do this all by herself because trying to get all these vehicles to go is one thing, but then they came upon the idea that they wanted to have everybody in period appropriate costume. And that is a lot of work for one woman to do. So she asked about 25 of her friends to help her start putting historic costumes together so they could start being placed inside of vehicles that were there for the parade. In addition to that, they put out a call that now that we're going to make this a very large parade, they needed to have people donate their carriages to Cheyenne Frontier Day so they could be used. And so we had vehicles that are used in the parades today that were not only purchased, as some of them were, but that sometimes people would unlock the gates at Cheyenne Frontier Days and there would be a carriage that they didn't know about sitting underneath the grandstands.
There was a donated carriage
It's a
there.
donated carriage. And so with all of this, and Cheyenne Frontier Days, as the organization was more focused on how the rodeo was going to work, they turned to Margaret Boyce and these women to actually try and figure out how to use these carriages, take care of them, and then use them in the parades.
And to broaden that entertainment value, but yet to bring the history along with it
Yes.
and to share that component. I look at the transportation components of really what made Cheyenne, starting with the railroad, the transcontinental, the Lincoln Highway,
Yes.
now here at the crossroads of two major interstate systems. We spoke in episode 3 about aviation and
Right.
what this meant. So certainly a beautiful way to honor and talk about those vehicles that were part of our legacy.
That's right. And that organization has been unbroken. And actually, in 1941, started calling themselves the Wheels. And from that point forward, they have always brought in new women that are willing to do the same thing. And the parades, especially the horse-drawn section, is primarily their responsibility and always has been. And they're an amazing group of women, considering that they have to put over 600 people into costume, because very rarely do you have people that ride in the parade more than once. That's 600 people for 4 performances. I'd like to see Broadway do something like that.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right.
Broadway, take a cue from Cheyenne Frontier Days and
Exactly.
the Wheels.
And it's a group of about 50 women, old, from very venerable to young people that are being brought in. And these people do it all without pay. I mean, exemplary examples of volunteers.
Well, and the collection of the carriages and many of these things are second to none right here as part of what you have at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum.
That's correct.
I'm always amazed at the vast collection of what we have here, and to think that this group of women is really behind bringing them to life for the Cheyenne parades and other things.
And they're always thinking about their heritage and the history of our event. They created the Old West Museum as well. So it's just an amazing group of women.
Yeah, it certainly would be. So the speaking of the Old West Museum and the founder there, tell us a little bit about Anne King.
Now, she is a wonderful person. Again, this is a woman that follows the same vein as many of the women we've talked about before, that grew up in Wyoming on a ranch and has that lifestyle and has that desire to preserve our heritage, but keep that entire lifestyle
Deeply
alive.
rooted in this Western
Deeply
way of
rooted.
life.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, her mother's father was Phil Yoder, who was a famous cowboy in the early part of the 20th century and actually created the town of Yoder,
Or
Wyoming.
Wyoming,
Right.
right up on Highway 85.
So, I mean, she's got this
Yeah.
connection, right?
Yes.
Well, she after she went to high school here in Cheyenne, her ranch was just out here to the west, went to high school here in Cheyenne, went to the University of Wyoming to study agriculture, married her husband while still in college, and he was a member of the King family, also a very important or prominent family for ranching here. And so she intended and probably was expecting that that was going to be her life for the rest of her days, and that's something that she would deeply, passionately loved. But in 1962, she decided that she was going to become involved with Cheyenne Frontier Days as a volunteer, and because of the Wheels, she became directly involved with them. And so she started, in addition to maintaining all of her responsibilities to keep the ranch running, would spend many, many days, months of time here at Cheyenne Frontier Days, helping the wheels organize those parades.
Just a lot of gratitude to the time and effort that she donated and contributed to what
Absolutely.
we have as an ongoing tradition and certainly a very popular event every summer
Every summer.
during Cheyenne Frontier Days.
Yeah, she did it for a period of 51 years. And that's just a remarkable stretch of time
Yeah.
that anybody stays involved with any organization.
I think one of the other things that, when we think about Cheyenne Frontier Days and during this time period of 1960 to the present is really the
Mm.
change in women and as competitors here at the rodeo itself and the development of the Women's Professional Rodeo Association.
Yes.
So, Christy Peterson, her rise to stardom was with the WPRA. And can you visit a little bit with us about Christy? I know that she was a captain at her local sheriff's department. She oversaw the jail. Again, another woman probably breaking some barriers.
Yeah, well, she certainly was an amazing athlete, but she came to Frontier Days for many, many years and got many WPRA titles. And Cheyenne Frontier Days is very fortunate to be involved with that as
Hmm.
being one of the premier events for barrel racing in the United States and
Yes.
the world.
Yeah.
And so she was extremely prominent in the early 1990s as being an exemplary athlete and was definitely someone, like you said, had another life beyond just being in rodeo,
Yeah.
but then took time out of the very busy schedule to participate and compete here at Cheyenne Frontier Days and was absolutely marvelous as a performer. Now, as it turns out, of course, she would be the first to mention that she could not be what she was as a champion barrel racer without her horse. And so she basically she was inducted into the Cheyenne Frontier Days Hall of Fame along with her horse Bozo.
Well,
And
I
he was a
think, yes.
remarkable animal too.
Yes. If you're competing as a barrel racer, it takes a good rider, but it takes a good
It
horse.
does.
Yes.
But she was the one that was responsible for training him.
Yeah.
And so he performed, she trained him. And it's a remarkable interrelationship between the riders and their animals to get to that point. And it was really a point that both she and her horse had to come into Frontier Days Hall of Fame at the same time because they couldn't have done it without each other. And
Yeah.
so she was really remarkable.
I think that we all appreciate the recognition of our animal athletes as much
Absolutely.
as we appreciate the recognition of our human athletes.
Indeed.
So let's talk about Charmaine James and her great horse Scamper.
Okay.
So Peterson followed that with Boza, which I think we just talked about. But Charmaine James was a big name in the world of women's professional rodeo and competed here many, many times. I know that, this is when we think about starting off at 1960 and then going through all of those national championships. These were women who were really setting records and had great history right here at Cheyenne Frontier Days.
Well, and they were building that sport. I mean, it's the barrel racing sport, of course, was something that didn't had, it was not one of the original women's cowboy sports.
Right.
This is something, like I said, we started with horse racing, we did saddle bronc, we did steer wrestling.
Mhm.
We had women that did all of this, but barrel racing was something that became very prominent after World War II. And this was something that was a new venue for women to get involved with and a spectacular sport to watch.
Yeah. It's still a fan favorite.
It's still a fan favorite.
Every day during the summer, during the 10-day rodeo performances, the barrel racing is still just a big part and certainly adding many of the other events too, which we'll get to in a minute. But I want to go back to someone else who has very well recognized Reba McIntyre, and her family has
Mhm.
a lot of deep connections with Cheyenne Frontier Days. Um, so she was, I think it was a couple of years ago, but she was being interviewed by Stephen Colbert, and she had an interesting story to talk about her first paid singing gig that took
Yes.
place right here at Cheyenne. Can you share a little bit about that? The circumstances were, and how Reba was paid?
Well, this is a lot of fun. I love that story, and she said it
Yes,
herself. I
she
mean,
did.
she mentioned it,
Yes.
when she was inducted to the Hall of Fame back in the early 2000s as well.
Hmm.
It's a very important part of her history. Now, her father got inducted into the Hall of Fame. He was a steer roper
Yes.
beforehand, and she traveled with her family from rodeo to rodeo to rodeo. As many people that are involved with the circuit would know, this is something that just
Mhm.
happens.
Yes.
The families travel together because if they didn't, there would be no way to see Dad during the summer
Yep,
months
exactly.
because he'd be out doing the rodeo. And so she was going with her family at the same time, going from place to place to place. And the family always had a nice special place to feel at home here at Cheyenne Frontier Days because it was the place where all the best of the best would always try and descend. This was the place to be, and this is the place where they would meet their friends from the road and otherwise.
It's called the daddy for a
It's
reason.
called the Daddy for a reason. And she was swept up in this along with her family, but she, of course, had this really nice ability, beautiful singing voice, even as a tiny child. And one of the favorite stories that she was telling folks is that while staying at the Plains Hotel, or even not staying at the Plains Hotel, she would be dropped off or brought by her family to the lobby of that wonderful establishment, and she would start singing songs for the cowboys who just happened to be there. And the only price she charged was a nickel a song.
Yeah. And her whole family, I know she is so proudly speaks about her rodeo family from competitors, her brother. She as and she's performed here. I've seen her a couple of different times at during Frontier Nights, but just a
Absolutely.
great connection to this well established and well recognized Western festival and rodeo event.
That's right. And it's amazing that she still has that connection. And so I'm very happy that she does.
Yes, I think so too. And then, um, as we talk about women's sports and the evolution of women's sports, the return of barrel racing and many of these things, there's a whole evolution that was happening during this time that brought us to today. Can you delve a little bit into that for us, Mike, and just share what some of the groundbreaking things that were happening in that time?
Well, the Pro Rodeo Cowboy Association that ran the rodeos ran into an issue in the 1930s. And this goes back a little bit further, and a little groundwork has to be laid about what was happening and what
Yes.
was coming back. During the 1930s, of course, with the Great Depression, things that were being done couldn't be done very well or very effectively at all. One of the things that we had mentioned in one of our previous podcasts is that women, one of the greatest events that they had was to be relay racers. And that meant, unfortunately, that if they were going from rodeo to rodeo, as we just mentioned, they'd have to take all their horses with them. And like cowboys that might have one or two horses, these women who rode in the relay races would have to sometimes bring up to four or five horses. And that became extraordinarily expensive. And so, unfortunately, during the period of the 1930s and the Great Depression,
Yes.
interest in women's rodeo sports declined very, very sharply because they ran out of contestants.
Yeah, I would think that it would be difficult during that time when, to provide feed and transportation and fuel and just bringing everything with you. So as it evolved,
As it evolved, well, as times got better, of course,
yes,
women wanted to get back into it, back in the saddle. Barrel racing was a fantastic venue. That was something that they decided to do. And so barrel racing really was the avenue that many women started coming back into the sport of rodeo because, yes, you did have to bring horses, not as many, but then there was a wonderful set of skill sets that they had to have that wasn't just racing the horses, but being able to train them to do those amazing turns that they can do
mhm,
in the cloverleaf during that event. But then that also started opening the door that women started saying, well, we did this before. Why can't we do this again? And in the mid 1980s, we had an opportunity for one of our chairmen by the name of Will Kalal was not only inviting senior steer ropers to come and perform here at at the CFD arena, he wanted to get women back into their traditional roles in the CFD as well. And so he started looking for female riders that could do everything from riding saddle bronc. Of course, naturally, we had trick riders that were coming back,
mhm.
but he also found in Johnny Jankowski, who's one of my favorite people in rodeo, and several of her colleagues who rode bulls too, which is something that nobody, even Mabel Strickland, would probably not really want to do in her day, in her best of
So this
times.
was the whole reintroduction of women into the what we know as the rough stock events.
That's right. And so they came back in. And so in the 1980s, the Cheyenne Frontier Days had the real wonderful pleasure of having these women perform and demonstrate their skills in front of our audiences. And then that continued to evolve as the popularity of barrel racing increased. Now we have a brand new event that has come in just within since 2019. Cheyenne Frontier Days is never static. They always bring in bull riding is a good example. Steer wrestling is another. That if something proves popular elsewhere in the rodeo world, we want to do it too
Yeah.
because that's what people are expecting. And now we have the wonderful sport of breakaway roping, which is bringing in a whole new generation of women competitors and new champions to our
In
arena.
including a broadening the fan base. You know, when we, introduced this podcast or this particular episode, we said evolving traditions, and you do that because you wanna know what your audience wants to see, but also how can you make it interesting and broaden that base, and I think is in the conversation around women, the things that you could see at Cheyenne Frontier Days today, if you were to sit in those stands on a beautiful July afternoon, you would see women competing in, bronc riding, and in steer riding, and in, barrel racing, and in all along the track events with, many of those, riding events and the other specialty acts. There's just women everywhere throughout those particular areas of competition and showmanship.
And they continue to do some things. I mean, right now we have the two events that they actually can get buckles and trophies with, which is breakaway and, of course, barrel racing. But what's really wonderful is on occasion, we have the fortunate occasion sometimes to have women who will actually dominate. They'll bring an exhibition event
Yes.
where women are the exclusive athletes and they compete against each other in saddle bronc. And that's been a wonderful thing to see.
Yes.
We had a group of women from all over the United States and Australia who came to perform here at Cheyenne Frontier Days in 2018 and did a remarkable demonstration. And that only opens doors even further for
Yes.
what might be possible.
Well, even as recently as 2023, you know, there were females competing in bronc riding, and
That's right.
so
That's
I
right.
think, you know, if you want to whet your appetite and certainly understand what it's like to see these women who are again, you know, they're full of grit and determination, and they embody the Western way of life and what it took to be able to settle this land, but also, you know, it still takes a lot of perseverance. You're out there with the elements. Let's talk about some of the women who've been really deeply connected to Cheyenne Frontier Days and what they're doing today that are making remarkable strides in just other areas of leadership. For example, our United States Senator Cynthia Lummis. She
Yes.
has a really great history, not only with her family in Wyoming, but here with Cheyenne Frontier Days.
It's amazing these women frequently follow the same pattern of all the cowgirls that have come before
Yes.
them. She was definitely a woman that grew up on the ranches of the Columbus Ranch here on south side of Cheyenne,
Yes.
and her family was always involved. As a matter of fact, her mother Enid was a wheel and was involved with the Old West Museum as one of our founders, and the family had no other thought than other being involved with Cheyenne Frontier Days to the point where Cynthia was also Miss Frontier in 1976 during the bicentennial.
Which was a very, very special time. I
Yes,
know she went on, throughout her career, she remained active in volunteering and was the first woman to serve on the Cheyenne Frontier Days CFD Inc. Incorporated Board of Directors.
that's right. And that is another interesting evolution that's happened. We have had the opportunity within the last 2 decades to see more and more women rising to the role of leadership within the organization and the sport of rodeo. And Cheyenne Frontier Days has had some remarkable women that have taken the positions. Cynthia Lummis, of course, was one of those board members, but we have so many other women that were able to, again, breach new ground
Yeah,
and become the first of their kind,
yeah.
and now deeply involved with creating the Cheyenne Frontier Days we know today.
Yeah, I think, you know, just a little bit more to brag on our United States Senator. You know, she served in the Wyoming House of Representatives.
That's right.
She was elected and served as our state treasurer, and then served as our U.S. Congresswoman, and then now serving as our junior senator in D.C., and still so connected deeply to her Wyoming roots, and so proud of her connection to Cheyenne Frontier Days.
Absolutely. She comes back and she's a good friend, not only of Cheyenne Frontier Days, but also our museum and helps us grow and is helping us get to the future we want.
Yes, exactly. Another, really exceptional woman and a good friend of mine, someone that I'm just so proud of her career trajectory and her affiliation with Cheyenne Frontier Days is Wyoming Supreme Court Justice Lynn Boomgarden, and she has a unique first with Cheyenne Frontier Days.
Yes, she is our first chairman on the committee to actually be able to manage one of the great committees that run the volunteer options and actions throughout that make the whole rodeo work.
Yeah, so traditionally, leading up to that time, the committee chairs were all male.
That's right.
And then Lynn took over as the chairwoman of the Indians Committee, which really then opened the door for many other women to rise up and serve as committee chairs throughout that time and to the present.
Into the present.
Into the present.
Yeah, the Indians Committee follows a lot of her leads. A lot of the women that are in charge of a lot of women have been in charge of the Indians Committee, but that has spread to other committees as well. And leadership roles are only expanding within the organization itself, not only in the boardroom, but also in operations, which is remarkable.
Well, and I think, that is just you're utilizing the talents and the expertise, regardless of gender, but to where they might present themselves. And that's what we would want for any organization, but even as humanity, to be able to capitalize on the talents of those and those who are willing to serve in
That's right.
such generous capacities. I know, in addition to Lynn, um, Lisa Murphy, another, just longtime volunteer
That's right.
active person throughout Cheyenne Frontier Days history. Lisa Murphy, she served on the Cheyenne Frontier Days board. She came in right after I did. I was fortunate to be one of those early members on the Cheyenne Frontier Days Inc. board of directors and served with Lynn Boomgarden. And then just as I was going off, Lisa came on.
Yes.
And she has another great milestone in that she was the first chairman of the board.
That's right. In charge of everything.
In charge of everything, which I don't know that many people, unless you're embedded in the CFD family and rooted here, but this is a vast enterprise. And so to be the chairman of the board of this entire enterprise is really something and a great responsibility, serving with the general chairman, the CEO, the president and CEO, just, a big responsibility. But I know Lisa she's, she's served her community in many different ways.
And continues to do so. I mean, she's a remarkable person that is so deeply involved. And it was fun. I mean, it's amazing to think when you're a chairperson of an organization this size, you're not only taking the organization into the future, you're talking about what happens on park, what happens within the organization's staffing, but you're also managing the thousands of volunteers. So it's a gigantic, as you said, a major operation. And it really is a testament to her skills and that she was able to do this and become the very first to do so. And Shine Frontier Days is thriving thanks to her efforts.
Well, and thanks to the many women who throughout time have been leaders in their own right and braved whatever it was that there were
That's right.
barriers that were preventing them from moving forward, but they did so with a strong constitution. And as we've discussed over the last 4 episodes, there's been amazing women. Well, we're certainly unable to cover all of the talents and the
It's
amazing women
impossible.
that have been out
Yes,
there that are shaping our history, that have shaped our history. But one of the greatest places where you can learn more about Cheyenne Frontier Days and the women who shaped this Western culture is right here at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum. Open year round.
open year round from 9 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock at night.
Yeah, I encourage everyone who is traveling through Cheyenne or if you live here, don't miss out on this jewel. This is a great way to learn more about the women and the eras of Western women. Thank you for joining us for this limited series CFD podcast, The Eras of Western Women.
Part of Western history, a legend walking tall.